The morning sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The air was crisp with the promise of a beautiful day ahead. Outside the Eastside Hells Angels clubhouse, engines roared to life one by one, breaking the early morning quiet. Mike, known to everyone as Grizzly because of his large build and thick beard, stood with his hands on his hips, watching as his fellow riders prepared for their journey. He'd been president of this chapter for nearly 15 years, and this charity toy run was his favorite day of the year. "Hey, Grizzly," called out a voice. "We got room for one more teddy bear in my bag?" Grizzly turned to see Pete, nicknamed Doc because he used to work as a paramedic before joining the club. Doc was holding up a fluffy brown teddy bear with a red ribbon tied around its neck. "Always room for one more," Grizzly replied with a smile. "Just make sure you can still sit on that bike of yours with all those toys." The clubhouse parking lot was filled with motorcycles of all kinds, mostly Harleys, their chrome parts shining in the morning light. Each bike was loaded with colorful toys, stuffed animals, and games. Collection boxes were strapped securely to several bikes, ready to accept cash donations along their route. Grizzly checked his watch. 24 riders had confirmed they would join the charity run, and all but 3 had arrived. The club had been doing this annual toy drive for the Children's Hospital for 7 years now. What had started as a small effort to improve their image in the community had grown into something much more meaningful. "Coffee's ready," announced Bella, Doc's wife, as she came out of the clubhouse carrying a large thermos. She was not a rider herself, but always helped with the charity events. "Get it while it's hot, boys. Going to be a long day on the road." Riders gathered around, grateful for the hot coffee. Despite their tough appearance, leather vests covered in patches, tattoos, big beards, and bandanas, there was an air of excitement among them. This wasn't just another ride. This was their chance to show the community who they really were beyond the stereotypes. "Tom called," said Bobby, nicknamed Wrench, for his skills as a mechanic. "His kid's got a fever, so he can't make it today." Grizzly nodded. "Family comes first. That's still 23 of us. More than enough to make an impression." In the distance, a news van pulled into the parking lot. Grizzly straightened his vest and ran a hand through his beard. "Look sharp, everyone," he called out. "Channel 8 is here." This was new. In previous years, local media had mostly ignored their charity efforts. Sometimes they even reported on the toy drive with a negative spin, focusing on the club's reputation rather than their good deeds. But this year felt different. A young woman stepped out of the van, followed by a cameraman. She approached Grizzly with a professional smile. "Mr. Thompson, I'm Lisa Chen from Channel 8 News. We'd like to do a short piece on your charity run for the evening news." Grizzly extended his hand. "Just call me Grizzly, please." "Everyone does, and we appreciate you coming out." Lisa nodded to her cameraman, who began setting up his equipment. "So tell me, how did the Hells Angels get involved with a children's hospital charity?" Grizzly looked around at his fellow riders, then back at Lisa. "Well, 7 years ago, one of our members had a daughter who was treated at St. Mary's Children's Hospital. She had leukemia." His voice softened. "The care she received there was amazing, and we wanted to give something back. It started small, just us delivering some toys, but it's grown every year." "And how has the community responded?" Lisa asked, genuinely curious. Grizzly chuckled. "Mixed at first. People see the leather and the patches and make assumptions. But it's getting better every year. More donations, more support. We're just regular folks under these vests, you know. Many of us have kids, jobs, mortgages. We just love the freedom of the road." As Lisa continued her interview, the final riders arrived. The parking lot was now filled with the rumble of idling engines and the buzz of conversation as club members did last-minute checks on their bikes. Big Dave, whose nickname was simply Tiny, a joke about his 6'4" frame, approached Grizzly with a map. "I marked the gas stops along the route," he said, pointing to several X's on the paper. "And here are the spots where we plan to stop for donation collections." Grizzly studied the map. Their route would take them through 6 towns, covering about 200 miles in a big loop that would bring them back to the city by evening. Most of these towns had welcomed them in previous years, or at least tolerated their presence once they understood the purpose of the ride. "Looks good," he said, folding the map and tucking it into his vest pocket. "But we're adding a stop here." He pointed to a small town on the map. Tiny frowned. "Millfield? We've never stopped there before." "That's the point," Grizzly explained. We need to expand our reach. Show more communities what we're about. What Grizzly didn't mention was that Millfield had a history with motorcycle clubs. Not a good one. A rival club had caused trouble there years ago, leaving the townspeople wary of anyone in leather on a motorcycle. But Grizzly believed in facing challenges head-on. If they wanted to truly change perceptions, they needed to go where those perceptions were worst. After Lisa finished her interviews and got some footage of the toys and the bikes, she approached Grizzly one more time. "One last question," she said. "What would you say to people who still see the Hells Angels as troublemakers, not charity workers?" Grizzly thought for a moment. "I'd say judge us by our actions, not by rumors or what you've seen in movies. We're not perfect, but we're trying to do some good in this world. Sometimes the people society is quickest to judge have the most to offer." Lisa smiled and thanked him for his time. As the news van pulled away, Grizzly gathered all the riders in a circle. "All right, listen up," he called out, his deep voice cutting through the rumble of engines. "Today isn't about us. It's about those kids at St. Mary's who are fighting battles way tougher than anything we've faced. It's about showing the world that we stand for something more than what they think." The riders nodded in agreement, their faces serious now. "We stick to the route," Grizzly continued. "We stay respectful in every town. We represent not just ourselves but every chapter of the club when we do this, so best behavior from everyone." He looked around the circle, making eye contact with each rider. "Any questions?" When no one spoke up, Grizzly nodded. "Then let's ride. Formation is planned. Doc, you take the rear. Wrench, you're right behind me. Let's make this the best run yet." The riders moved to their bikes, adjusting their gloves and helmets. Grizzly swung his leg over his Harley, a custom bike he'd built himself over the years. The engine roared to life beneath him, the vibration familiar and comforting. As Grizzly led the group out of the parking lot, he couldn't help but feel proud. The sight in his mirrors was impressive. A long line of motorcycles, their riders sitting tall, the morning sun glinting off their chrome. Each bike was decorated with small signs announcing their charity drive, and the colorful toys strapped to the bikes added a strange but heartwarming contrast to the tough image of the riders. The first few miles were through the city, where early morning joggers and dog walkers stopped to watch the procession. Some waved, others just stared. Grizzly waved back at everyone, especially the children. That was the point, to show that beneath the intimidating exterior were just people trying to make a difference. As they hit the highway, Grizzly opened up the throttle. The wind rushed past, carrying away all other thoughts. This was what freedom felt like. The open road ahead, trusted friends behind, and a purpose that made it all meaningful. What none of them knew as they rode out of the city, spirits high, was that their well-intended route through Millfield would lead to trouble. The small mechanical issue that would strand them there was still hours away, undetectable in their pre-ride checks. For now, they were simply 23 riders with big hearts and good intentions, their charity boxes empty but ready for the generosity they hoped to find along the way. The sun climbed higher in the sky as they thundered down the highway, a brotherhood on wheels bringing hope one toy at a time. Little did they know that by day's end, they would need someone else to bring hope to them. The convoy of motorcycles thundered down the highway, a ribbon of chrome and leather stretching across the asphalt. They had been on the road for almost 3 hours now, stopping twice in friendly towns where they had collected a good amount of donations. The toy boxes were filling up nicely, and the cash donations were better than expected. Grizzly led the pack, occasionally checking his side mirrors to make sure everyone was keeping up. The morning clouds had burned away, leaving a clear blue sky and sunshine that warmed their backs despite the cool October air rushing past them. First stop went well, Tiny said during their brief rest at a gas station just outside of Riverdale County. He was counting the cash from the morning's collections, tucking it safely into a locked box. "We're already up to $500 plus all the toys." Grizzly nodded, pleased. "People are starting to get it. They see what we're trying to do." As the riders refueled their bikes, Grizzly unfolded his map and checked their route. Their next stop would be Millfield, the town he had specifically added to this year's run. He hadn't told the others about the town's history with motorcycle clubs. Maybe he should have, but he figured what they didn't know wouldn't worry them. "Millfield's about 40 minutes from here," he told the group as they prepared to get back on the road. "Small place, but might be worth the stop." Doc raised an eyebrow. "You sure? Never been there before?" "New territory. Grizzly said with a shrug. Can't change minds if we don't go where minds need changing. Back on their bikes, they continued their journey. The highway narrowed as they entered Riverdale County, the landscape changing from open fields to rolling hills with scattered farmhouses. It was pretty country, peaceful in the midday sun. About 20 minutes after leaving the gas station, Grizzly noticed something wrong with his bike. The engine stuttered, losing power momentarily before catching again. He frowned, checking his gauges. Everything looked normal, but the bike definitely felt off. Behind him, Wrench pulled alongside. "You okay?" he shouted over the engine noise. Grizzly nodded, but just as he did, his bike coughed again, worse this time. He signaled to pull over onto the shoulder, and the entire convoy followed suit. "Something's not right," he said as he got off his bike. Wrench was already kneeling beside it, his experienced eyes scanning for problems. "Try starting it again," Wrench suggested. Grizzly hit the ignition, and the engine turned over but ran rough, sputtering and threatening to die. "Cut it," Wrench said. "Don't want to damage anything." 3 other riders were now having similar problems. Doc's bike wouldn't start at all, and 2 others were running as poorly as Grizzly's. Wrench unscrewed the gas cap on Grizzly's bike and sniffed. His face wrinkled in disgust. "Fuel's contaminated," he announced. "Must have been something in the tanks at that last gas station. Water in the fuel maybe, or some debris." He looked up at Grizzly. "We can clean out the fuel systems, but I need tools and a place to work. Can't do it here on the side of the road." Grizzly checked his map. "Millfield is closest. About 15 minutes up the road. Can the bikes make it?" Doc asked, looking worriedly at his own motorcycle. "If we take it slow," Wrench said. "But no guarantees." With no better options, they carefully got back on the road, the affected bikes sputtering along while their riders nursed them forward. The rest of the group adjusted their pace, staying protectively around the struggling bikes. The "Welcome to Millfield" sign appeared sooner than expected. A weathered wooden board announcing a population of just under 2,000. The main street was like many small-town streets across America. A handful of stores, a post office, and a diner with a neon open sign flickering in the window. Grizzly spotted the diner with its adjacent parking lot and signaled to turn in. It seemed like the best place to stop and figure out their next move. The rumble of 24 motorcycles turning into the lot drew immediate attention. Faces appeared in the diner windows, and a few pedestrians on the street stopped to stare. As they parked, Grizzly noticed how quickly the atmosphere changed. A woman hurried her children across the street away from the lot. An older man paused in sweeping the sidewalk in front of his hardware store to watch them with narrow eyes. "Friendly place," Doc muttered as they dismounted. "Let's just figure out the bikes and be on our way," Grizzly replied quietly. "Wrench, what do you need?" Wrench was already examining the affected motorcycles more closely. "Need to drain the contaminated fuel? Clean the fuel lines and injectors. Might need to change the fuel filters too." "I'll see if there's an auto parts store in town," Tiny offered, looking up and down the main street. Grizzly nodded. "I'll ask in the diner. Maybe they know a local mechanic who could help." The diner, called Betty's Place according to the sign, fell silent as Grizzly walked in. About a dozen customers sat at various tables and booths, all turning to stare at him. Behind the counter, a middle-aged woman with dyed red hair stopped pouring coffee midstream. Grizzly smiled, trying to look as non-threatening as possible. "Afternoon," he said, hoping someone could help us out. "We've got some bikes with fuel problems. Is there a mechanic in town?" No one answered immediately. Then the woman behind the counter set down her coffee pot. "Frank's garage is 2 blocks down," she said, her tone neutral but not friendly. "But he's out fishing today. Any other options?" Grizzly asked, still maintaining his smile despite the frosty reception. An elderly man sitting alone in a corner booth looked up from his coffee. He had to be in his 70s with thin white hair and glasses perched on his nose. He studied Grizzly with an unreadable expression but said nothing. Before anyone could answer Grizzly's question, the sound of vehicles pulling into the parking lot drew everyone's attention. Through the windows, Grizzly could see 2 pickup trucks blocking the entrance to the lot, effectively trapping their motorcycles inside. "Looks like Joe called the boys," someone muttered. Grizzly felt a prickle of unease. This was exactly the kind of situation he'd been warned might happen in Millfield, but he'd hoped those days were past. He turned back to the counter woman. "Look, we're not looking for any trouble," he explained. "We're on a charity run for the children's hospital in the city. Just need to fix our bikes and we'll be on our way." The woman's expression softened slightly, but before she could respond, the diner's door swung open. A tall man in a sheriff's uniform stepped in, hand resting casually on his holster. He looked to be in his 50s with a weathered face and hard eyes that scanned the room before settling on Grizzly. "Afternoon," the sheriff said, his voice deceptively friendly. "I'm Sheriff Tanner. Mind telling me what brings a bunch of Hell's Angels to our quiet little town?" Outside, more pickup trucks had arrived. Men were getting out, gathering around the parked motorcycles. Grizzly's fellow riders were standing in a tight group now, clearly aware of the growing tension. "Mechanical problems, Sheriff," Grizzly replied evenly. "Contaminated fuel. Just need to fix our bikes and we'll move on." The sheriff walked closer, looking Grizzly up and down, taking in the patches on his vest, the club president insignia. "Contaminated fuel, huh?" he said, skepticism heavy in his voice. "And what's with all the toys and collection boxes? Running some kind of scam?" Grizzly took a deep breath. He could feel the situation slipping out of control, but losing his temper would only make things worse. "Annual toy drive for St. Mary's Children's Hospital," he explained, pulling a folded flyer from his vest pocket and holding it out. "Official charity event. We've been doing it for 7 years now." Sheriff Tanner didn't take the flyer. Instead, he glanced out the window at the gathering crowd. "You boys picked the wrong town to stop in," he said quietly. "We had some trouble with bikers a few years back. Left a bad taste in everyone's mouth." "That wasn't us," Grizzly said firmly. "We're just passing through. No intention of causing any problems." The sheriff seemed to consider this, then turned toward the door. "Bring your paperwork outside. I want to see everything. Registration for those bikes, driver's licenses, whatever permits you have for this charity work." Grizzly followed him out, heart sinking as he saw the scene in the parking lot. At least 30 locals had gathered now, their faces ranging from curious to openly hostile. His fellow riders stood by their bikes, tension evident in their postures. The toys and donation boxes that had seemed so innocent earlier now looked out of place amid the growing confrontation. "What's going on, Grizz?" Doc asked quietly as Grizzly approached. "Just stay calm," Grizzly murmured. "Everyone stay calm and let me handle this." But even as he said it, he could see the situation was already beyond easy handling. A tow truck had pulled up alongside the gathered pickups, its driver leaning against the hood with his arms crossed, watching them with a smirk. And just like that, their simple charity run had turned into something much more complicated. Trapped in a town that had already decided who they were based on nothing more than patches and rumors, the Hells Angels found themselves facing a long afternoon, and it was only going to get worse before it got better. Sheriff Tanner stood with his legs apart and arms crossed, looking every bit like a man who enjoyed the power his badge gave him. The crowd of locals had grown, forming a loose circle around the Hells Angels and their motorcycles. The atmosphere crackled with tension. "Let's see those permits," the sheriff demanded, holding out his hand to Grizzly. Grizzly reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a folder. Inside were all the official documents for their charity run. Approval from St. Mary's Hospital, tax forms showing their nonprofit status for the event, and permits for collecting donations in public spaces. "Everything's in order," Grizzly said, handing the papers over. "Like I said, we do this every year." The sheriff flipped through the documents with a frown, as if disappointed to find them legitimate. He handed them to a deputy who had joined him, a young man who looked barely old enough to have graduated high school. "Check these out," Tanner instructed. "Call the hospital, verify everything." While the deputy stepped away to make the call, Tanner turned his attention to the collection boxes secured to some of the motorcycles. "Open those up," he ordered, pointing to the nearest box. Doc, who was responsible for that particular collection box, looked to Grizzly for guidance. Grizzly nodded and Doc unlocked the metal box. Inside was the money they had collected so far, nearly $700 in cash. The sheriff peered inside, then looked up with renewed suspicion. "That's a lot of cash to be carrying around on motorcycles," he remarked. "How do we know this is really going to sick kids?" One of the younger riders, a man called Rookie because he'd only been with the club for 6 months, stepped forward. His face was flushed with anger. "Are you calling us thieves?" Rookie demanded, his voice rising. "We busted our butts collecting that money fair and square for those kids." "Step back," Sheriff Tanner warned, his hand moving to rest on his holster again. Grizzly quickly moved between them. "Rookie, cool it," he said firmly before turning back to the sheriff. "Every penny goes to the hospital. We have receipts from previous years if you want to see them." The crowd had grown larger still. Among them, Grizzly noticed several men wearing the logo of a local trucking company on their caps. They were watching with particular hostility, whispering among themselves. From the diner doorway, the red-haired woman who had spoken to Grizzly earlier called out, "Sheriff, maybe you should just let them fix their bikes and move on. They don't seem to be causing trouble." "Stay out of this, Betty," one of the truckers shouted back. "You don't know what these guys are capable of." "Actually, I do know what they're capable of," Betty replied. "They're capable of raising money for sick children, which is more than I've seen from some folks around here." Her words caused a stir in the crowd. Not everyone, it seemed, was against them, but the truckers and several other men moved closer, their faces hard with anger. "You weren't here when that other gang came through," one of them said loudly. "Trashed the bar, started fights, scared everyone half to death." "That wasn't us," Grizzly repeated, struggling to keep his voice calm. "We're not that club." "All you bikers are the same," another man called out. Inside the diner, the elderly man who had been watching earlier remained in his booth. He sipped his coffee slowly, his eyes never leaving the scene outside, taking in every detail with surprising sharpness for someone his age. The deputy returned, phone in hand. "Hospital confirms they're expecting a donation from the Hells Angels East Side chapter," he reported reluctantly. "Annual event, like they said." Sheriff Tanner's jaw tightened. This news should have diffused the situation, but instead he seemed even more determined to find something wrong. "Well, that's the charity part," he conceded. "Now let's talk about those motorcycles. I want to see registration for every single one of them." Wrench, who had been quietly examining the affected bikes during this confrontation, stood up. "Sheriff, with all due respect, we just need to fix our bikes and get going. We're already behind schedule on our charity run." "You'll leave when I say you can leave," Tanner snapped. The tension ratcheted up another notch. The Hells Angels exchanged glances, their patience wearing thin. These were proud men, not used to being pushed around or treated like criminals without cause. Rookie, still seething from earlier, muttered something under his breath. "What was that?" the sheriff demanded, stepping toward him. I said, "This is bull—" Rookie started, but Grizzly cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Registration papers are in our wallets," Grizzly said quickly, trying to redirect the sheriff's attention. "Everyone get your papers ready." As the riders reached for their wallets, a sudden shout came from one of the truckers. "He's got a knife." Everything happened very fast after that. Sheriff Tanner drew his gun, pointing it at Rookie, who had indeed been reaching for his back pocket, but for his wallet, not a weapon. "Hands where I can see them. All of you," Tanner shouted. "Against the wall now." "There's no knife," Grizzly protested, but it was too late. The accusation had lit a match to the already volatile situation. "I said against the wall," Tanner repeated, waving his gun. "Spread 'em now!" With no choice, the Hells Angels did as they were told, lining up against the diner's outer wall, hands on the bricks, legs spread. The humiliation burned hot in their faces as the locals watched. "This is completely unnecessary," Grizzly said as the sheriff roughly patted him down. "Shut up," Tanner growled. "I'm going to search every one of you, then every one of those bikes. And if I find so much as a speck of illegal substances or a single weapon, you're all going to jail." The deputy began searching their motorcycles, opening saddlebags and dumping contents onto the ground without care. Toys spilled across the parking lot. Teddy bears, dolls, action figures, all destined for sick children, now scattered in the dirt. The sight of their charity donations being treated so roughly was the final straw for many of the angels. Even Grizzly, usually the voice of reason, felt his temper rising dangerously. "Those are for kids with cancer," he said, his voice tight with anger. "You're out of line, Sheriff." Tanner ignored him, continuing his search. When he reached Doc, he found a prescription bottle in his pocket. "What's this?" he demanded, holding it up. "My heart medication," Doc explained. "I had a minor heart attack last year. That's my prescription with my name on it." The sheriff squinted at the label, then pocketed the bottle. "We'll see about that." By now, 3 tow trucks had lined up at the edge of the parking lot. Their drivers stood watching the scene, keys in hand, ready to impound the motorcycles at the sheriff's command. Inside the diner, most customers had left, not wanting to get involved in whatever was happening, but the elderly man remained, finishing his coffee with unhurried sips. He watched as the sheriff continued his search, finding nothing illegal despite his obvious disappointment. Going to search the bikes next, Tanner announced, and these tow trucks are going to take them all to the impound lot for a more thorough inspection. On what grounds? Grizzly demanded. You've found nothing illegal. We've done nothing wrong. Suspected stolen vehicles, the sheriff said with a thin smile. Need to run all the VINs, make sure none of these fancy bikes are hot. It was a transparent excuse and everyone knew it. This wasn't about law enforcement anymore. It was about power, about teaching the outsiders a lesson just because they could. The Hells Angels exchanged looks of growing desperation. Their bikes were more than just vehicles. They were prized possessions, often built and customized by hand over years. The thought of them being roughly towed away and impounded was almost unbearable. Worse still, if their motorcycles were impounded, they would miss the rest of their charity run. All the children waiting at the hospital for their annual visit, all the donations they had yet to collect, it would all be lost. Please. Grizzly tried once more, swallowing his pride. Think about the kids at the hospital. We're already behind schedule. They're waiting for us. For a moment, something like doubt crossed Sheriff Tanner's face. Perhaps he was finally considering that he might be overreacting. But then one of the truckers called out from the crowd, "Don't fall for it, Bobby. That charity stuff is just a cover. We all know what these gangs are really about." The sheriff's face hardened again. He gestured to the tow truck drivers to start hooking up the motorcycles. It seemed there was no way out. The Hells Angels were about to lose their bikes, their donations, and their dignity, all because of a prejudice they couldn't overcome, and a small-town sheriff with too much power and too little judgment. And still, from his booth by the window, the elderly man watched. His coffee cup was empty now, but he made no move to leave. His eyes narrowed slightly as the first tow truck driver approached Grizzly's motorcycle, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he slowly pushed himself to his feet, reaching for the cane that leaned against his table. The old man in the diner slowly rose from his booth, reaching for his wooden cane. He was tall despite his age, though his back had begun to curve with the years. His movements were deliberate, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world despite the chaos unfolding outside. Betty, the diner owner, noticed him standing. "Mr. Miller, can I get you anything else?" she asked, concern in her voice. "No, thank you, Betty," he replied, his voice surprisingly strong for a man who had to be in his late 70s. "I think I need some fresh air." Betty gave him a knowing look. "Walter, maybe you should stay inside." "This isn't your problem." The old man, Walter Miller, smiled faintly. "When something happens in Millfield, it's everyone's problem. That's what community means." He made his way to the door, leaning on his cane more heavily than he might have needed to. As he pushed it open, the bell above jingled, drawing a few glances his way. But most eyes remained fixed on the confrontation in the parking lot, where the first tow truck driver was preparing to hook up Grizzly's motorcycle. Walter stepped outside, the autumn air cool on his face. For a moment, he simply stood. Odd there, taking in the scene. The line of Hells Angels with their backs against the wall, the sheriff's aggressive stance, the hostile crowd, the scattered toys on the ground. He began to walk forward, his cane tapping a steady rhythm on the asphalt. The sound drew attention and people began to notice him. A path opened up through the crowd automatically, the townspeople making way for him without being asked. "Bobby," Walter called, his voice cutting through the tension. "Bobby Tanner." The sheriff turned, annoyance crossing his face until he saw who had spoken. His expression shifted immediately to something between respect and wariness. "Judge Miller," he said, "you should go back inside, sir. We're dealing with a situation here." Walter continued his steady approach until he stood between the sheriff and the line of bikers. "I can see that," he said mildly. "Question is, what kind of situation are you dealing with? Because from where I was sitting, it looks like you're harassing a group of men who've done nothing wrong." A murmur went through the crowd. Judge Walter Miller was not just any elderly resident of Millfield. For over 30 years, he had served as a county judge before retiring. His reputation for fairness and wisdom extended throughout the region. There wasn't a person in Millfield who didn't respect him, even those who had stood before his bench for one reason or another. "With all due respect, sir," Sheriff Tanner said, lowering his voice, "you don't know who these men are, don't I?" Walter asked. He turned slightly to look at the Hells Angels. "Seems to me they're men on motorcycles who had the misfortune to break down in a town that's determined to judge them before knowing them." He looked down at a teddy bear lying in the dirt, then carefully bent to pick it up, brushing it off with a gentle hand. "Sir, these are Hell's Angels," the sheriff insisted. "We had trouble with bikers before." "Different club, different men, different time," Walter interrupted. "I was here for that incident too, remember? The men responsible went to jail. I presided over their case." He held up the teddy bear. "Those men weren't collecting toys for sick children, as I recall." He turned to Grizzly. "May I see your paperwork, young man?" Grizzly looked surprised but nodded toward where the sheriff still held their folder. "It's all there, sir. Everything's legitimate." Walter held out his hand to Sheriff Tanner, who reluctantly handed over the folder. The old judge put on reading glasses that hung from a cord around his neck and carefully examined each document. The entire parking lot had fallen silent. Even the most hostile members of the crowd seemed unwilling to speak against Judge Miller. The tow truck driver had stopped what he was doing, waiting to see what would happen next. After a few minutes, Walter closed the folder and looked up. "As I thought," he said. "Everything's in order. St. Mary's Children's Hospital." His voice softened on the name and something passed across his face, a shadow of old grief. "Fine institution. They do good work there." He handed the folder back to Grizzly rather than the sheriff, a small but significant gesture. "Bobby," he said, turning back to Sheriff Tanner, "I've known you since you were stealing apples from my orchard as a boy. You're a good man at heart, but right now you're letting old fears cloud your judgment." The sheriff's face reddened slightly at the mention of his childhood mischief. Some in the crowd chuckled softly, the tension beginning to ease just a little. Judge Miller, one of the truckers, spoke up. "You can't just let these guys off the hook because of some paperwork. They could be dangerous." Walter turned to face the man who had spoken. "Tom Fisher, isn't it? You work for Millfield Trucking now, but if memory serves, you were quite the hellraiser yourself in your younger days." He smiled slightly. "As I recall, your father had to bail you out of my courtroom more than once." Tom Fisher looked down, unable to meet the judge's gaze. Walter addressed the crowd more broadly now. "I understand your concerns. When those other bikers came through years ago, they left a mark on this town, but holding these men accountable for something they didn't do isn't justice. It's prejudice." He tapped his cane on the ground for emphasis, and that's not what Millfield stands for. He turned back to Grizzly. "Now you said you had mechanical problems?" Grizzly nodded. "Yes, sir. Contaminated fuel from a gas station back up the road. Damaged the fuel systems on 4 of our bikes." Walter considered this. "My son-in-law Paul owns the auto shop on Elm Street. He's closed today, but I have a key." He glanced at his watch. "I could give him a call, see if he'd be willing to come help you out." The offer hung in the air, significant not just for the practical help it offered, but for what it represented. Acceptance, trust, a hand extended where moments before there had been only hostility. "We'd appreciate that very much, sir," Grizzly said, his voice rough with emotion. Sheriff Tanner looked like he wanted to object but couldn't find the right words in the face of Judge Miller's authority. Finally, he holstered his weapon and took a step back. "Fine," he said tersely, "but I'll be keeping an eye on things." "As you should," Walter agreed. "That's your job. But watching isn't the same as presuming guilt." He gestured to the tow truck drivers. "These gentlemen can go. Their services won't be needed today." The tow truck drivers looked to the sheriff, who after a moment of internal struggle nodded curtly. They began to climb back into their trucks. Walter pulled a cell phone from his pocket, an old flip phone, practical rather than fancy, and dialed a number. "Paul?" "It's Walter," he said when someone answered. "Got a situation at Betty's Diner. Some folks on a charity run had mechanical trouble. Yes, they're on motorcycles. Hell's Angels, actually." He listened for a moment, then chuckled. No trouble. Just some contaminated fuel. 4 bikes affected. You can. Wonderful. We appreciate it." He hung up and turned back to the group. "He'll be here in 15 minutes with his tools. Says he's dealt with fuel system problems before." The Hell's Angels were still lined up against the wall, not yet sure if they were free to move. Walter noticed their uncertainty and frowned at the sheriff. "Bobby, I think these men can stand normally now, don't you? They're guests in our town after all." Reluctantly, Sheriff Tanner nodded. "You can step away from the wall," he told the bikers. As the Hell's Angels moved away from the wall, stretching stiff muscles, Walter spotted Doc bending to pick up the scattered toys. "Let me help you with that," Walter offered. carefully kneeling despite his age to gather a doll from the ground. Doc looked surprised but grateful. "Thank you, sir." "Walter, please," the old judge corrected him. "And you are?" "They call me Doc," he replied. "Used to be a paramedic before I retired," Walter nodded. "A medical man. Admirable profession." He looked down at the doll in his hands, then back up with a more somber expression. "I have a personal interest in St. Mary's, you know. My grandson Jimmy was treated there for leukemia." The simple statement carried weight that silenced everyone within hearing distance. Even the truckers who had been most hostile looked uncomfortable now. "Did he—" Doc began, then stopped, not wanting to ask the obvious question. "He passed away 3 years ago," Walter said quietly. "He was only 8. But the care he received at St. Mary's was extraordinary. The doctors, the nurses, they gave him dignity in his final days. And they supported our family through the hardest time of our lives." He handed the doll to Doc, who placed it carefully back in a collection box. "So when I see men collecting toys and donations for that hospital, I don't see patches or motorcycles or whatever history you might carry. I see people trying to make a difference for children like my Jimmy." Betty had come outside and stood listening. At Walter's words, she wiped a tear from her cheek. "Why don't you all come inside while you wait for Paul?" she suggested to the bikers. "Coffee's on the house." The crowd of townspeople began to disperse, some looking ashamed of their earlier hostility, others still wary but no longer openly antagonistic. Sheriff Tanner remained, his face a mask of conflicted emotions. "Bobby," Walter said to him quietly, "sometimes the hardest part of wearing that badge is admitting when you've made a mistake. Takes a bigger man to back down than to double down." For a moment, the sheriff looked like he might argue. Then his shoulders slumped slightly. "I'll be in my car," he said. "Call if there's any trouble." It wasn't quite an apology, but it was as close as his pride would allow him to come. As the sheriff walked away, Grizzly approached Walter. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "Not many people would have stood up for us like that." Walter shrugged. "I didn't do it for thanks. Did it because it was right." He smiled slightly. "And because I've lived long enough to know that you can't judge a book by its cover, or a man by the patches on his vest." Together, they walked toward the diner, where Betty was holding the door open. The worst was over, but the day still held more surprises. Not all of them bad. Betty's diner had never seen customers quite like the Hells Angels before. The bikers sat somewhat awkwardly at the tables, their leather vests and tattoos standing out against the checkered tablecloths and homey decor. But as coffee was poured and conversation hesitantly began, the strangeness started to fade. Walter Miller sat with Grizzly and Doc at a corner table, listening as they explained more about their annual charity run. "We visit the kids at the hospital after we finish the ride," Grizzly was saying. "Bring the toys, spend time with them. Some of the guys dress up as Santa's helpers." Walter smiled at the mental image of these tough-looking men in elf costumes. "How did your chapter get involved with this particular cause?" he asked. Doc looked down at his coffee cup. "My daughter Lily," he said quietly. "She was diagnosed with leukemia when she was 6. Spent almost a year at St. Mary's." "I'm sorry," Walter said, his eyes reflecting his own grief. "Did she—" "She made it," Doc said, a smile breaking through. "She's 17 now. Wants to be an oncology nurse because of what she went through." He pulled out his wallet and showed Walter a photo of a smiling teenage girl. Walter studied the photo, then nodded. "She has kind eyes. She'll make a good nurse." Outside, a pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. A man in his 40s with grease-stained coveralls and a toolbox got out. "That's Paul," Walter said, rising from his seat. "My son-in-law. Best mechanic in 3 counties. They went outside to meet him." Paul looked a bit wary of the bikers at first, but relaxed when Walter made the introductions. "Contaminated fuel, huh?" Paul said, already kneeling beside Grizzly's motorcycle. "Let's take a look." Wrench joined him. And soon the two men were deep in conversation about fuel injectors and filters, speaking the universal language of mechanics that transcended any differences between them. "Going to need to drain the tanks, clean out the fuel lines and replace the filters," Paul announced after examining all 4 affected bikes. "Got the parts in my shop. Shouldn't take more than a couple hours." "We can't thank you enough," Grizzly said. "We're already behind schedule on our run." Walter had been thinking. "While Paul and your friend work on the bikes, why don't I give the rest of you a tour of Millfield? Might as well make good use of your time here." The offer surprised everyone, including Betty, who had come outside to check on things. "A tour?" she repeated. "Walter, what are you up to?" The old judge smiled. "Just being neighborly, Betty. These men are stuck here for a bit. Might as well get to know the place." And so, in one of the strangest sights Millfield had ever seen, Walter Miller led a group of Hell's Angels on a walking tour of the small town. They started down Main Street with Walter pointing out historic buildings and sharing stories about the town's past. At first, locals stared from windows and doorways. But curiosity soon overcame caution. Walter had lived in Millfield his entire life and knew everyone. He made a point of introducing the bikers to shopkeepers and residents, treating them like any other visitors to town. "This is Mrs. Wilson's bakery," he said, stopping in front of a small shop with delicious smells wafting from the open door. "Best apple pie in the state." A plump woman in her 60s appeared in the doorway, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron. She looked uncertainly at the group of leather-clad men. "Afternoon, Walter," she said. "Quite a group you've got with you." "These gentlemen are on a charity run for St. Mary's Children's Hospital," Walter explained. "Mechanical troubles brought them to our town." At the mention of the hospital, Mrs. Wilson's expression softened. "My sister's grandson was treated there last year. Wonderful doctors." She disappeared inside, then returned with a box. "Take these to the children," she said, handing it to Tiny. "Fresh cookies." Tiny, who towered over Mrs. Wilson, accepted the box with surprising gentleness. "Thank you, ma'am. The kids will love these." As they continued their tour, word spread through town. The story of Walter standing up to Sheriff Tanner, the truth about the Hell's Angels charity mission, and the personal connection to little Jimmy Miller, whom many in town had known. It all combined to change the atmosphere. People came out to meet them, some offering donations for the hospital. A toy store owner insisted on contributing a bag of small stuffed animals. The local pharmacy gave a gift card to help the hospital buy supplies. "Never seen anything like it," Doc murmured to Grizzly as they walked. "This morning they were ready to run us out of town." Grizzly nodded. Amazing what happens when people take the time to listen instead of judge. Their tour eventually led them to Millfield Retirement Home, a modest building with a well-kept garden. Walter stopped at the entrance. "Thought we might stop in here," he said. "If you don't mind. There are some folks inside who don't get many visitors." The Hell's Angels exchanged glances, uncertain. This hadn't been part of their plan for the day. But after everything Walter had done for them, how could they refuse? "We'd be happy to," Grizzly said. Inside, the retirement home was clean and bright, but had that institutional quietness that such places often have. A few residents sat in a common room watching television or reading. "Walter," exclaimed a nurse at the front desk. "Twice in 1 week. And you've brought friends?" "These gentlemen are passing through town," Walter explained. "Thought they might like to meet some of our distinguished residents." What had started as an awkward courtesy visit soon transformed into something unexpected. The elderly residents weren't frightened by the bikers' appearance. Many of them had lived through wars and hard times. It took more than leather and tattoos to intimidate them. In one corner, Tiny sat listening to an 85-year-old former Marine tell stories about fighting in Korea. In another, Doc found himself engaged in a serious chess match with a retired mathematics professor. Rookie was showing a group of elderly ladies photos of his custom motorcycle, while they showed him pictures of their grandchildren. But the most surprising connection was between Grizzly and Frank, a 90-year-old former motorcycle rider himself. "Had a Harley in '53, Frank was saying, his voice thin but excited. "Panhead engine. Rode it all the way to California and back." "No kidding?" Grizzly said, genuinely impressed. "That was some serious riding for those days." "Different times," Frank nodded. "No fancy highways like now. Just open road and adventure." The visit extended much longer than planned. When the nurse finally hinted that it was nearly dinner time, the Angels reluctantly said their goodbyes. Several residents made them promise to stop by again next year. Outside the retirement home, Walter received a call from Paul. The bikes were fixed and ready to go. By the time they returned to Betty's diner, the sun was beginning to set. Paul and Wrench had successfully repaired all 4 motorcycles, and the rest of the Angels had gathered back at the parking lot. To everyone's surprise, a small crowd of townspeople had also assembled, not hostile this time, but supportive. "We took up a collection," announced Tom Fisher, the trucker who had been so antagonistic earlier. He looked embarrassed as he held out an envelope. For the kids at the hospital. Figure it's the least we can do after, well, you know. Grizzly accepted the envelope, finding it stuffed with cash. This is incredibly generous, he said. Thank you. Betty had set up a table outside the diner with coffee and sandwiches for the road. Can't send you off hungry, she insisted. As the Hells Angels prepared to leave, something unexpected happened. Sheriff Tanner's patrol car pulled up, followed by a deputy in another vehicle. The sheriff got out and approached Grizzly. For a moment, tension returned to the air. Then Tanner extended his hand. Safe travels, he said simply. Grizzly shook the offered hand. Thank you, Sheriff. Thought you might like an escort to the county line, Tanner added, not quite meeting Grizzly's eyes. Roads can be tricky after dark. It was as close to an apology as the proud sheriff could manage, and everyone understood what it meant. The Hells Angels mounted their bikes, the engines roaring to life in the quiet evening air. Collection boxes, now significantly fuller than when they'd arrived, were secured for the journey ahead. Walter stood beside Paul as the bikers prepared to leave. You did a good thing today, Paul said to his father-in-law. Walter shook his head. Just reminded people to look with their hearts, not just their eyes. He stepped forward to shake Grizzly's hand one last time. You're welcome in Millfield anytime. Next year we'll be ready for you. Make us an official stop on your charity run. Count on it, Grizzly promised. He looked around at the gathered townspeople, the same ones who hours earlier had been ready to run them out of town. Thank you all. We came here by accident, but I'm glad we did. With a nod to Sheriff Tanner, the Hells Angels pulled out of the parking lot, the police cars at the front and rear of their formation, not to escort them away in shame, but as an honor guard showing respect. The residents of Millfield stood watching until the rumble of motorcycles faded into the distance. Then they turned to each other, a little surprised at how much had changed in a single afternoon. Well, Betty said, breaking the silence, that was certainly the most interesting day Millfield's had in years. Walter Miller leaned on his cane, a small smile on his face as he watched the last taillights disappear around a curve. Sometimes it took unexpected visitors to remind a community of who they really were, and who they could be when they chose to see beyond appearances and stand up for what was right.